We're a little late here, but hopefully time for a few questions. I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative, since I have the microphone, of asking a question off of Peter Hare's call for a history of religion that takes pragmatism seriously as a religion. And I'm no Luke Manand, but I am trying to write that history. I'm not asking this question just to advertise my half-written work, but really because there's a problem with the label religion that I'm struggling with, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on. You rightly identified Bildung as really, really important to the kind of religion that pragmatism is or was. And in my research, this grows out of the liberal religious tradition in America, and is quite continuous with Romantic and Unitarian and Congregationalist ways of looking at religion. But who accepts that as religion? I mean, this is part of the question. When James wrote Varieties, he said in a letter to a friend that he thought that it would be popular because it was too supernatural for the scientists and too natural for the theologians. So what's very interesting about that, right, is that he thought it would be popular because of that, showing that he thought that both the theologians and the scientists were extremists, and that most people were in the middle. But of course, as people study the history of religion, as you know, of course, they don't study pragmatism. Pragmatism belongs to philosophy. And if they study James's religious beliefs, they tend to, with obviously important exceptions in this room, but tend to study just the varieties and think that it ends there, right? So in his time, however, I just came across this one little tidbit in the Boston Evening Transcript in the early 20th century, when a theosophist was on her way to Boston and everybody was expecting her. And the editorial said, New England used to be the place where religions got started. And we think of ourselves as a kind of nursery for religions, but we haven't been doing that for a long time. And now here's this foreign religion that has to come over here. And then the editorialist said, but stay, come to think of it, there is a new religion out from New England. It's called pragmatism, and Professor William James is its chief prophet. But to our taste, it is too like a chocolate eclair. It's sweet and squishy. And I think that this is a charge that persists, right? Is this religious, or as you put it, philosophical theology? That's right, yeah. Is it too squishy? Does it need some dogma to give it some structure? And is it any different from humanism? And so, really behind this, what is the value of calling it religious? And sort of what work is done by that term?
Well, of course, I thought was, if I really knew the answer, I've been worried about the same thing for more than 50 years. So if I had an answer, I would. Anyway, but I was suggesting if you really got deeply, as some people are beginning to, deeply into Peirce and Royce on this, the very complex theories, it wouldn't seem squishy anymore. Part of the problem is people they weren't equipped to do it in many cases. Or there was no motivation to do it. I mean, who was going to publish this stuff, you see? I mean, the religious journals they don't want, what's all this philosophy of mathematics in there? I mean, that's hopeless. And then particularly, even today, among professional philosophers, of course, everyone is trying, not everyone, not planting, they're trying to distance themselves from religion. So it's very awkward that way. So I just mentioned one little example. I tried very early on in the 60s use this label of quasi-theism that upset everybody. So I didn't know what to use. But I should point out that in my experience, peddling this stuff for 50 years, the word pragmatism gets you in terrible trouble all over the place. I mean, you're constantly trying to go into the whole thing again. But then people ask me, the Germans would say, well, now what other term are you going to use? I don't know what other term to use. I wish there was some term that didn't have awful baggage that one could use to describe that tradition. But I don't know what it would be. So I agree that these categories, the category of religion or categories within philosophy of pragmatism, people get, partly it's a matter of packaging. I think James might like this, this metaphor. The problem is that how are you going to package this tradition so that you can peddle it? And people try different things, and then some people just get obsessed by the packaging, and they don't really do the detailed work on Royce and Peirce and such people. Right? But I don't, as I say, I don't have any answer to that question. That's why I'm hoping for somebody. I'm hoping you can do it. Who will find a way of expressing this with words that somehow or other are not so off-putting to people, that they'll once catch it. And it seems to me once it gets some momentum, then you see everybody will clamber on board, and you'll find when. As McDermott would say, of course, back when we all started this, we were in the wilderness. No one gave a good goddamn about pragmatism. Now, of course, everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people, they either want to be a pragmatist or they want to be a critic of pragmatism. Well, I think that if you could once get the story out of what I'm talking about, and in a way which is not too off-putting, then suddenly everyone would start taking an interest in these things, because it didn't seem so foreign. But I wish I knew how to do it. That's all I have to offer, which is not much.
Please. Wait for the microphone to come.
I will advertise a piece of work I'm working on that's not quite finished. If Randy Alksher hasn't given up on me, I'm working on an essay for Hillary's Library of Living Philosophers volume, and I haven't finished it yet, but the title is "What is the Use of Calling Putnam a Pragmatist?" And so I got two quick questions. Yes. All right. Two quick questions. One, are you a pragmatist? And two, that'll make writing this paper a lot easier if I know the answer to that question. And two, beans aren't a classification, right?
What?
I mean, you contrasted it. James, you quoted James contrasting mere classifications of beans by number, by color, etc., right? And then there's something else you could do with beans besides classify them. You could call them beans, which is what they really are. Sorry, that won't work, right? Beans is just another classification.
Yeah.
And, it's as disposable. I mean, not disposable, right? I mean, you do want to, it's very useful, right? That's why it's useful. That's why it's true to call them beans, because it's useful. Just as it's useful to classify them by number and by color and so on. So I think James sort of missed his own point there.
I don't call myself a pragmatist, and I don't call myself a Wittgensteinian. I don't like movements. I think movements in philosophy should be temporary, right? They are useful as a way of calling attention to something, creating an ecological niche for a new idea so that people can discuss it and criticize it. But I am uncomfortable being classified as an ist of any kind. But I would say I've learned an enormous amount from, especially from James and Dewey, from Peirce, James and Dewey. There's a question that these are, and from pragmatist teachers. In fact, from pragmatist teachers I had already in college as an undergraduate. One of my professors, C. West Churchman, who was himself a student of Edgar Singer Jr., who was himself a student of William James, wrote on the blackboard, and he attributed this to E.A. Singer Jr., which I always do when I quote it. 1, knowledge of facts presupposes knowledge of values. 2, knowledge of values presupposes knowledge of facts. 3, knowledge of theories presupposes knowledge of facts. 4, knowledge of facts presupposes knowledge of theories. And I still quote those 4 Singerian propositions whenever I can. That the interdependence of fact and value is, it seems to me, one of the great contributions of American pragmatism. And On the beans, I think the beans is, of course, it's a letter to a friend, and by itself, I think he would not probably use it in print, because by itself, it suggests that the reality consists of these atoms, the beans, which is not what he meant. But I think that he did mean that this notion of being in contact with a reality. It's interesting, Wittgenstein, his lectures on philosophy of mathematics, also says that I don't object to talking about corresponding to realities in some context. I mean, to say, if I talk of the sofa the green sofa in my study, to say the word sofa corresponds to that sofa is all right. I wouldn't say that the absence that when I say there are no yellow books in my room, that corresponds to something. There's a thing called the absence of yellow books in my room. So in other words, it's interesting both that they want to deflate the notion of correspondence, not just reject it, and also that both James and Wittgenstein speak of realities with a small r in the plural, not of reality with a capital R as a single thing, as a super thing, to use Rorty's phrase.
We have a question up here.
I would just like to return for a moment to whether or not James was a psychologist or a philosopher. And I am interested in the perception of the folks up front here on that, because I think there's a contemporary division that's made which makes philosophers ignore his psychology, and makes psychologists also ignore the kind of psychology that he actually was into, and then the philosophy of psychology that he tried to propound on them. So they kind of threw him out of psychology. Their so-called father decided that, Wundt was going to be their father. And instead, what James did was he became a public lecturer. And he found his way into philosophy, and yet at the same time, I see him as a very distinguished part of the pantheon of American philosophers, and yet Russell and Santayana both claimed that, he did nothing but make raids on it, and he was really a psychologist. So, any comments?
I certainly think the Principles of Psychology is certainly maybe the best single book ever written in psychology, and Wittgenstein loved that book. And
Right. But the origins of radical empiricism, according to James's claim in his presidential address to the American Psychological Association, appear to be in psychology, not in the way philosophers interpret philosophy today.
Yeah. Well, I think I agree with. Turn that one over to David Lambert.
Well, I mean, as you well know, there are interesting comments to make. Lots of interesting things one could say about that. But one of the crucial ones is to recognize that from James's point of view, the line between psychology and philosophy is quite a fluid one, far more fluid than it becomes 10, 20 years hence. And so, I think every good book on James doesn't ignore the principles because it's impossible to figure out sometimes what he's talking about without going back to read it if you're in philosophy. And conversely, you have to look elsewhere as well, all the way down. Now, James didn't seek. I mean, it's just crucial to note. James actually worked very hard to get out of his responsibilities in psychology at Harvard, which is different from getting out of an interest in psychology. But he didn't discover philosophy late in the game. He actually had been writing philosophical essays and didn't demarcate this line very clearly going all the way back.
Well, he has a psychology after 1890 that's generally ignored by both philosophers as well as psychologists.
Well, let me just add.
That leads to his radical empiricism.
Yeah.
I would say the heart of radical empiricism, however, is direct realism. And direct realism is not a psychological thesis.
But I wanted to mention that I think that his two things. James's influence, immediate, short-term influence in philosophy was quite different from Royce, but also was enormous. The principles, it's a long story, but people like Alex Klein can tell it. the principles had enormous impact on the discussion of epistemology and realism early in the 20th century. But on the other hand, I talked at great length many years ago with Sheldon, who got his PhD with Royce in 1899. And I was rather naive about these things in 1960 when I talked to Sheldon. And he said, Hare, you don't understand. When I was a student at Harvard in the 90s, every graduate student wanted to work with Royce because he was considered absolutely the cutting-edge technical philosopher. And they didn't want to work with James. I mean, if they were in psychology, or there were a few people like Dickinson Miller, but by and large, their image of what was a cutting-edge philosopher was Royce. But that didn't mean that the principles couldn't be enormously influential in certain problems, such as the problems of realism.
Cornel West.
Essentially, we do know that when William James was asked to receive an honorary degree here at Harvard, he was fearful, if not terrified, that they would say William James psychologist rather than William James philosopher.
Yeah.
So that the title had some honorific gravitas in his own mind vis-a-vis the discipline that he had come out of. But that's just digression. Just three quick points in regard to these questions that you all raised. The first one, for me, the crucial one, is about the need for Vico and other historians and historicists who understand the relation between the order of ideas and the order of institutions that Vico spends so much time on in the new science. That when we talk about history, they talk about history, it tends to be so flattened out. It's almost interpersonal temporality and personal temporality with not a lot of structures, not a lot of institutions. And the C. Wright Mills and others tried to provide some corrective in this regard. But it's something that is really worth talking from Vico to Marx, we could say. And somebody like Zaid, who, of course, who was a disciple of Vico. How do you understand discourses and structures of ideas linked to institutional structures, the political economy, the academy itself as a form of institutional networks connected to political economy and so forth. Those are the kind of questions that you just don't get out of Royce and James for the most part. In terms of popular culture, of probably the leading James in would be Larry Wachowski, who wrote the Matrix. Because I'm sure many of you know he underwent a radical conversion from Schopenhauer to William James in writing that. And that's one of the reasons why I spent the time that I did. And Ken Wilber and I have a long discussion on it. We have a discussion of every scene in all three films on the market for years.
Yes.
Linked to Larry's transformation. And the transformation came from reading The Will to Believe. Mm-hmm. From reading The Will to Believe. And then when I had given him Santayana, which remember Santayana says, William James didn't believe. He just believed that people had the right to believe that they might be right if they believed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which is very fascinating, Santayana reading, which is a way of kicking in providing some gusto, some strenuous mood being preserved. And Wachowski ends up in the second and third thing with the critique of messianic models, the humanization, and then human beings having to work with themselves, believing in themselves in the second and the third reload in Revelation. So in terms of popular culture, that's very important because Larry Wachowski is a very serious philosopher, even though he dropped out of philosophy program here in Boston at Emerson College. The last point had to do with, I just wanted to share a story with my dear brother Dick Rorty. I'm sure you all know that he's struggling with disease, and we love him so firm, even though many of us believe he's wrong about a lot of things. And misled some people sometimes in terms of readings of James and Dewey. That's all right, he's still our brother. But I recall asking him, as I often do, so many philosophers. We know that Heidegger had Dostoevsky on his wall. We know that Quine had Carnap on his wall. And I always like to ask philosophers which figure they have on their walls. I asked John Rawls. He said Abraham Lincoln without a beat. But I asked Dick Rorty, who he'd like to have on his wall. And he said, without a beat, William James. And I said, how could that be so? He said, because I would give my left arm to write like that. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
This question down here, front corner.
I think I can heard enough.
No.
Both a suggestion and a question. The suggestion is this. It's interesting, you talked, Professor Putnam, about the direction in Russell's life between his emotions and his intellect. Another autobiography of another philosopher, John Stuart Mill, writes of a nervous breakdown caused by the same collapse between his intellect and his heart. And it's interesting that his salvation came through discovering the poetry of Wordsworth. And I'm going to connect back to what Professor West said, the poet again. The poet as philosopher, the philosopher's poet. That maybe the answer to this divorce between the emotions and the intellect might occur through poetry, if not Wordsworth, some other poet. So I'll make that suggestion, bridging what you said, Professor Putnam, with you, Professor West. My question very simply is this. What is the status of Royce's psychology? We talk about James's psychology, as you did, but I understand that Royce himself wrote a program of psychology, I forget what it was called, which had a certain vogue at a certain time, and was completely ignored when the principles came out. So I'd like some comment from somebody about the status of Royce's contribution to psychology proper. Thank you.
Let me answer. Frank isn't here at the moment. Frank often says that, relative to this, that James in the Principles says that he got his view of belief from Royce. So but that's a favorite theme of Frank Oppenheim's, but that's just one aspect. So Frank likes to argue that you shouldn't consider it just one way. It was a two-way street in psychology.
I don't know Royce's writings in psychology, but I've read his own notes for his last, I think it was Philosophy 15, for the metaphysics course that he taught his last year at Harvard. And there's one section on that I think it's appropriate to share with the Royce conference. He's attacking what we would now call methodological individualism. And it's a charming lecture, and he says, well, I don't believe there are individuals. The lecturer in this course is not the same person as the professor who teaches such and such a course, which is also one of his courses, as of course all the students know. And that's not the same person as the person who teaches such and such a course. And that was yet another course. It's communities all the way down. I am a community, and becoming an individual is a project. And that seems to me a rather brilliant piece of psychology there on which one could build a great deal. Whereas James, one of the strangest things, and I would love to have this interpreted, is that in the Principles of Psychology, he talks about our experiencing ourselves as a core self. This image of the core self, which is a center of Protestant activism, which is almost Kantian. He's almost saying phenomenologically, it's the way Kant said.
But as you recall, he gives several theories of the self.
Yes, right.
You got a menu there.
I think there's time for one or two more questions. There's one right here in the center.
Since Wordsworth was mentioned with Mill, it's appropriate to say, too, James's famous breakdown, everybody knows about Renouvier, but in fact his reading of Wordsworth is absolutely essential. Not only that, but the exact same work, The Excursion, and precisely Despondency Corrected, which, by the way, one of my great thrills in life, because I respect so much what Ignace Scripscalis does in his work, is that, in fact, the last quotation in the Principles is left not identified. It is, in fact, James quotes Wordsworth at the very end. It's very essential. It's worthwhile noting that the same thing was important to Darwin as well. So that underscores the importance of poetry. Just as a little throwaway, somebody asked about what do we do about politicians. I'm from Virginia, and I'm proud about our governor, Tim Kaine, and meeting him, and right away, it didn't take very long to start talking about James. And so there's at least one governor in the United States who gives away copies of varieties of religious experience to his friends and enemies to try to get them thinking seriously about what matters.
Right next to him.
Just going back a little bit to the conversation about James, whether he was his career as a philosopher and psychologist and so forth. I think it is right that, of course, he was seen different ways by the public, and he had different titles, professor of physiology, professor of psychology and philosophy and so forth. But my sense from reading all this stuff, is that he was actually all these things all the time. That is, it's really impossible, or it's difficult to understand, for instance, the varieties that you just mentioned without knowing his psychology, without knowing his physiology, and without knowing what comes after it, the pragmatism. It's all there. And that's sort of what makes him appealing, I think, to many people, because he is so incredibly interdisciplinary, even though we've reconstructed him in these ways that are right, that he had this interest, and he had this interest, and he had this interest. No, for instance, we know that when he was studying for his medical school exams, he was reading philosophy. He wasn't reading medicine. I mean, you get all these constant examples that all throughout all of his writing. So, there's... let's take us why he's claimed by so many disciplines and loved by so many people, even though we're all different and so forth.
The interpretive scheme that Cornel West used, talking about it, about the humanist project, I think gets to the sort of disciplinary location of James much better than, and Royce as well, than do these other distinctions, which they move in and out of professionally and socially. In many respects. And I think one can't underestimate the valence they have at different points as well. I mean, the comment I made about James's aspirations for his Gifford lectures and also for his much promised and never delivered book on metaphysics are certainly real, but nonetheless, they don't really create boundaries around the kind of things that he applies his mind to.
Maybe I should add that Rosanna and I have a daughter who lives in Grass Valley, California, and I'm happy to tell you that the goodest citizens of Grass Valley now have a plaque on the main street to Josiah Royce.
Well, thank you all for coming. The conference has been very engaging. I want to say to you, if you're interested, we're going to be doing something with what we just did here for the last day and a half or two. So you can get in touch via the conference website or email address, which you've all interacted with or mostly interacted with over the next weeks, and we'll post some information or push out information to you about that. And finally, I'd just like to take this last opportunity to thank the people who've been chasing us around through the building once again. Barbara Bowles, Stephanie May, Julie Reed, and Tim Fink, who have really facilitated this all the way through. So I'd ask you to give them a hand.